that's okay. Why am I not good enough to be treated better by him/her? Rachel was a 40-year-old woman with 2 teenage children who had called the therapist's office and asked for an appointment. She was clearly distraught and emotional and had a hard time scheduling her appointment through her tears. She reported to the office manager that she needed to be seen for her relationship problems with her husband of 17 years, who she had recently found out had been sleeping with a coworker and had told her that he wanted a divorce after being confronted. The therapist encountered Rachel at the first appointment, and the impression she gave was that she appeared, on the surface, to be a very successful and self-disciplined woman. She appeared to have been exceptionally athletic, attractive, and successful at her career in human resources. However, she gave off a very fragile and dependent vibe at the same time. Rachel described herself as having been married to a man a year younger than her, who she had met directly after college. She had previously caught him texting other women at a couple points in years past, but always patched up the relationship and pushed forward. But now she was devastated at the idea of losing him. In taking stock of the relationship that she had with this man, Rachel pointed out numerous examples where she went above and beyond to take care of his needs in ways that he didn't even consider reciprocating in return. She unintentionally described this man as insensitive and brusque, macho sort of individual who seemed fixated on what he could get from her, rather than having any idea of what he was supposed to give in return for what he wanted. As Rachel and the therapist discussed how she was processing this reality that he wanted a divorce and chose to leave her for another woman, she regularly reflected back and stated, "I don't know why I wasn't good enough for him, so that he would treat me better and be faithful too," in a variety of different ways. This seemed to be her primary way of making sense of his behavior and the interpretation that she was fixated on as the main problem. The main question in her mind was whether her success or failure at being a good wife determined whether her husband would or would not have cheated on her. She was consumed with guilt, worrying that she had caused his behaviors. Responding to a loved one's bad behaviors or decisions with, "Why wasn't I worth treating better?" or "Why wasn't I good enough to deserve you acting differently?" It is a common thing to say. In fact, as I'm writing these very words, I have heard this exact phrase on 3 occasions from my clients in the past week sessions. On all 3 occasions, it's been a response to someone cheating and was an expression of feeling absolutely betrayed and that their marriage or relationship was irreparably damaged. And while I'm including it in this book because I don't believe it's the right way to interpret this kind of situation, I definitely feel empathy when someone says to me, as it is understandable, wrong turn in what has to feel like rush hour traffic and a maze of one-way streets after discovering something painful about someone you are deeply invested in. Let's explore why this is a place people go when they feel hurt and betrayed, and why it isn't the right turn to make when these kinds of things happen. Once again, this is a typical thing that people say when the relationship goes really, really wrong. It's an understandable conclusion to come in the heat of the moment. I believe that it is an attempt to explain the other person's behavior and make sense out of it when it doesn't seem to make sense right off the top. The question that should be asked when any relationship goes south or turns sour is, did this happen because of me and who I am and what I've done? Or did this happen because of them and who they are? In other words, was this me or was this them? When I hear this in the midst of people's grief and emotional bleeding, I know that what this statement means is that the victim of the poor behavior has decided that it's me. They are asking why their spouse or boyfriend, girlfriend, or whomever didn't consider them, their value, and their feelings in the decision-making process before doing something destructive. They also ask why the strength and quality of their relationship was not some sort of braking system or deterrent from them acting the way that they did. Now, I am of the opinion that it is perfectly understandable to believe that your value in the eyes of other people would have some influence on how they behave and how they conduct themselves. I would suspect that parents would like to think that their children will not misbehave because they respect and value them. It seems reasonable that someone in committed relationships would like to think that they would be important enough to be considered and to have some leverage over how their partner acts. The same reasoning and rules would generally apply to friendships, relationships with business partners, and perhaps an employee-employer relationship. It is normal to try to process and understand our own experiences and the influence that we have on others around us that we are intimately involved with. I have no problem whatsoever with this. I also have no problem with the idea that we do modify our behavior regularly to not offend and not to disappoint someone we care about or not to damage that union. This is where it gets tricky, because it sounds like I'm justifying the statement. Why was I not good enough for them and not able to act right? The way I tried to explain the difference was by telling the story of the 3 suitcases. Once upon a time, in my younger days, I was involved in the restaurant business. I frequently traveled out of town to conferences where the trainings were held about management, growth, or legal issues. We would be holed up in a very nice hotel somewhere as a group. My experience was that there were 3 kinds of people that went with me on these conference trips, and you could tell who they were by what they did after they set their suitcases down in the hotel room. For the sake of the story, I have to say that most people that I was on these conferences with were men, at a maybe 85 to 50% ratio. Almost all were at the place in life where they were either married, engaged, or had a long-term girlfriend that they were committed to. The first guy set his suitcase down in the hotel room and immediately thought about heading down to the hotel bar or going out on the town and looking for some action with a girl. Whether he felt any conscience about potentially cheating on the woman waiting on them back home or not is inconsequential to what he does as he is on the hunt. The second guy set his suitcase down and told himself that it is wrong to give in to the urge to find companionship, and he said that he hopes he can resist temptation to do something that will damage or hurt the woman waiting for him back home. This guy knows what is right and says to himself, I hope I can get through this week without getting into trouble. Maybe he does, and maybe he doesn't. It's up in the air. The third guy sets his suitcase down and says to himself, I don't know what's going to happen over the next week or 2 with this conference, but I do know I'm not the kind of guy who cheats on his woman and breaks his commitment. Period. Many, many years ago, I went to a convention in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. I remembered having a conversation with this guy that we went out to dinner with. He was maybe a handful of years younger than me, and he gave me a fantastic testimony about how much he loved his wife. He talked about how she was a wonderful, noble woman who was fabulous to live with and great at raising kids, and that she had been really understanding when he had lost his job in the world of business. She suffered through the struggles and headaches that came with him building a new career in the restaurant business. He even showed me a picture of her, and she was a very nice-looking blonde gal who looked very much the part that of what he had described as he bragged on her looks too. I just sort of cataloged this as a good story of a successful marriage and was glad to hear it. A couple of days before the conference ended, I finally gave in to the guys who had been asking me to go out to the karaoke bar where they had spent most of their evenings, pounding chicken wings, knocking down beers, and warbling out country music songs on the microphone. It wasn't but 5 minutes after I got there that this guy who had given me a great testimony about how much he loved his wife jumped up on stage and started crooning a boozy version of Garth Brooks' Shameless to this nondescript sort of pudgy girl in the front row who was clearly completely infatuated with him. The guy sitting next to me threw a confiding elbow into his ribs and leaned over to say, he's been sleeping with her since the second day he was here, and then added with irony that her kids are calling him daddy. with an accompanying laughter. If I was telling this story in a session to someone, the question I would be asking is whether the young guy's behavior really said anything about his wife's femininity, attractiveness, or personal worth, or did it speak to his character and personal traits? The point of my story about the 3 suitcases is that if you try to tie these individuals' decision making to the bow of the person they are attached to, then you completely diminish their capacity for an independent moral choice or specifically developed an individual values about relationships and sexuality and fidelity. It would then make their wives responsible for whatever their husbands decided to sexually act out on the road at these conferences and make the men's behaviors a complete reflection of their woman's value. Doesn't that sound ridiculous? It almost sounds like we're saying that these women have some sort of remote control ESP subliminal control over these guys to moderate how they choose to act, think, and feel. In reality, the decision is based on pre-planned moral values and immediate impulse control. I just do not believe that people make these kinds of choices and decisions based on external relationships, no matter how good they are or how bad they are, but on their own internal beliefs and values. You could, in theory, see someone trying very hard to maintain control because they didn't want to hurt their wife, fiance, girlfriend, but again, that wouldn't simply be resisting the pre-existing value that says, I would give in and do something pleasurable and impulsive and reckless if it were up to me. It would not change or transform that value. I understand completely, however, why this is such an appealing thing for us to say to ourselves. It would be wonderful and would give us a great sense of security if we had some way of keeping our wives or husbands or boyfriends, girlfriends, or fiancés from making terrible relationship choices about faithfulness because of what we did or who we are. Having this kind of control would do wonders for people's sense of security as long as things went well, but it would also give us a sense of control and security when things go badly. In Rachel's case, instead of having to admit that she made a poor marital choice and picked someone who did not have the same relationship values that she did, she could place the blame on herself, and this would give her hope. This way, she could tell herself that his behavior was a reflection of her. And if she could just find a better way to be a better wife and a better person, then he would be magically transformed and he would never cheat again. She would not have to go through the pain and misery of being dragged down the alley full of broken glass that divorce is. One of the core foundational pieces of lifelong depression, in my opinion, is the childhood belief that we can somehow find a way to transform a lacking parent or parents into who we need them to be through our own emotional efforts. What I'm saying is that someone, as a child, who is struggling, that a parent is either neglectful or abusive and is feeling that pain of either the good things that they aren't getting or the bad things they are getting, is going to naturally assume responsibility for what the parent does. No normal child of 8, 9, or 10 years of age would likely be able to understand the process why their mother is an alcoholic who tends to go into fits of anger and rage directed at them when she's inebriated. This is way too much to ask of someone so young and very inexperienced, and not only understanding why people think and feel the way that they do, but also doesn't have much life experience to develop a reasonable hypothesis in the first place. The child just naturally assumes that it's happening because they aren't good enough as a child, and that is an honest reflection of their deepest and most core worth. Then what happens? The child will usually try to improve their behavior and be a better kid, with the hope that this will somehow transform the alcoholic mother into a warm, loving, and nurturing parent that the child craves and desperately needs. Of course, this does not happen. The child's worth is not why the mother started drinking, abusing alcohol, and self-medicating. It could be one of any 100 reasons why Mama picked up the bottle and used it to try to cope with something inside her. The child assuming responsibility is part of our own adolescent narcissism, but is also understandable because we don't have any real depth or frame of reference to naturally evolve out of this narcissism into some higher state of understanding until we are older and more experienced. This assuming of responsibility for how our parents treated us, though, also gives us hope that we can miraculously transform them into who we need them to be if we just keep trying hard enough emotionally. This assuming of responsibility keeps us from falling into a deep pit of despair, as we will never get that which we need from them. This is the root of codependence that builds deep-rooted depression. Coming to the realization that we do not have any true control over someone else's values, beliefs, or core motivations for how they choose to act is both painful and liberating at the same time. To accept the fact that we do not have any control over someone else's core self leaves us in a state of not knowing for certain how someone that we love and are attracted to will choose to act under pressure or temptation to do something wrong. What it does do, on the other hand, is free us from having our self-esteem and self-worth hitched to someone else's runaway chuck wagon to determine who we are. The good part is that you are freed from responsibility of trying to control other people's behaviors. You can be plenty good enough to be treated well, but that is not the issue. Your value does not determine someone else's moral choices. What it does mean is that you have an obligation to examine this person thoroughly before you put your precious trust in their hands. Hopefully, this realization will lead to an examination of the other person's values. It is hard to accept the reality that Suitcase Guy makes his own decisions based on what he alone believes about relationships and life, and we have no real control over this process. In Rachel's case, it could be absolutely true that she was or was not the best wife that she could have been to her husband. She might have been the kind of wife who was screechy and demanding and put a lot of negative pressure on her husband to meet her emotional needs. She might have lacked warmth and was emotionally unavailable. Maybe she didn't pay enough attention to his romantic and sexual needs or his deepest, most intimate feelings. I would have no problem with someone like Rachel reviewing her performance in the relationship and critiquing it objectively and seeing what maybe she could have done better or should do better in her future relationships going forward. What I would have a problem with is if she believed any of her feelings, deficits, or a lack of emotional self-control or presence had any real bearing on her husband's behavior with other women. I would even go as far as to say that if she were really not a good wife and may have affected her husband to where it may have made it easier for him to justify his cheating behaviors, but it would have no direct, concrete bearing on what he chose to do in his private moments of opportunity for infidelities. There are plenty of people I have met in my adult life who have been in very uncomfortable and dysfunctional relationships who chose not to be deceitful and unfaithful despite not getting their needs met in the present. One situation does not equal or justify the other. Rachel's case was not an easy one, even for her very experienced and seasoned therapist. There were many 3 steps forward and 2 steps back sequences in the 1.5 sessions that followed. Her therapist was patient and understanding with this back and forth process, which really spoke to her attempt to determine how much her behavior had influenced other people, how much her behavior influenced what other people ultimately chose to do and act. The turning point in therapy for Rachel was when the therapist was able to effectively separate her behavior from her husband's by addressing the 2 separate points of whether Rachel had been an emotionally pleasing wife versus her husband's values about infidelity. The therapist asked Rachel if she believed that a better sprinkler system on the 94th and 95th floor of the World Trade Center building would have prevented 9/11 from happening. Rachel quickly recognized the absurdity of the question and rightfully answered that even if sprinklers had been operating at maximum capacity, It still would not have prevented WTC-1 from catastrophically coming down. The therapist then suggested that the sprinkler system was like whether she was a good wife or not, and the building coming down was the result of her husband having a value that he should pursue pleasurable and enticing sexual relationships for gratification, no matter whether he was married or not. This separated the two issues conclusively for the client, and Rachel was able to begin seeing her estranged husband as someone with a defective moral character and low impulse control, who would have acted the way he had, no matter how well she acted, what she looked like, or what she did for him throughout the marriage. Rachel eventually changed this distorted question from, why was I not good enough to make him a faithful husband, to a more appropriate question, why was my husband not good enough to be a successful marriage partner? She successfully placed the responsibility for the destruction of the marriage on him and began to feel less and less depressed about the divorce in the midst of her pain and the loss going through the breakup. After about 18 months of painful process and therapy, Rachel began seeing a man who was a much more appropriate potential partner and left the counseling center in much less codependent and more stable emotional place, ready to live her life more successfully.